There are three specific phases in a woman's life when her desire for a relationship with a man often becomes much stronger. The raw reality explained in detail. There are certain moments in a woman's life when her need for emotional connection, companionship, and partnership increases dramatically. This does not happen randomly. It is not purely emotional either. It is deeply connected to psychology, biology, and life circumstances. And if you are a man who fails to recognize these stages, you will continue misunderstanding women again and again. Most men assume women approach relationships the same way throughout their entire lives. That assumption is completely inaccurate. Human behavior research reveals something far more complex. Developmental psychologists from the University of Chicago, who studied female relationship motivation across different age groups, discovered something people rarely discuss openly. A woman's desire for a partner does not remain stable over time. It intensifies during three very predictable phases of life, and what she seeks during each phase changes completely. What researchers found even surprised many experts themselves. Let's begin with the first phase, usually between the late teenage years and the early 20s. This is the exploration stage. During this period, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, judgment, and future-oriented decision-making, is still developing. Because of this, her attention is heavily focused on the present moment. She is drawn toward experiences, emotional excitement, passion, novelty, and intensity. She is not constantly thinking about where life will take her 5 or 10 years later. She is thinking about what makes her feel alive right now. At this point, she is rarely searching for permanent stability. Instead, she is collecting experiences, learning about herself, and discovering what emotions and personalities attract her. The men who capture her attention during this stage are often the ones who bring energy, spontaneity, confidence, excitement, and emotional stimulation into her life. But this is where the shift slowly begins. The second phase usually appears between the ages of 25 and 30. During this period, her environment starts changing rapidly. Friends begin getting married. People around her start building families and settling into more serious lifestyles. At the same time, what many people refer to as the biological clock, something neuroscientists acknowledge as a genuine psychological and biological influence, rather than just a cultural myth, begins creating a subtle but persistent sense of urgency. Researchers from Columbia University who studied female attachment patterns observed that during this stage, women often begin evaluating men very differently, sometimes without even realizing it consciously. Now the focus shifts toward long-term potential. Stability becomes more attractive, character matters more, reliability matters more, emotional maturity matters more. Future security begins carrying greater weight. The same woman who at 21 was fascinated mainly by excitement and emotional intensity may, at 28, start carefully analyzing consistency, ambition, dependability, emotional intelligence, and the ability to build a stable future. This is why many men become confused when a woman suddenly raises her standards or changes what she expects in relationships. They assume she became difficult or inconsistent overnight, but there is usually a deeper reason behind that transformation. Her priorities evolved because her stage of life evolved. Then comes the third phase, typically between 38 and 45 years old. This is perhaps the most misunderstood stage of all. By this point, she has lived enough life to gain clarity. She has experienced success and disappointment. She may have already experienced love, heartbreak, sacrifice, betrayal, or emotional exhaustion. She has built parts of her identity independently, and now enters a stage many women describe as one of the most emotionally revealing periods of their lives. Her priorities shift once again. She is no longer focused on impressing people. She is no longer chasing superficial excitement for its own sake. What she begins valuing most is emotional safety, authenticity, peace, honesty, and consistency. Not financial security alone, but emotional stability and genuine presence. Psychologists often describe this as a transition toward authenticity, During this stage, surface-level attraction loses much of its power, while emotional depth becomes significantly more important. She becomes less interested in performance and more interested in sincerity, less interested in fantasy, and more interested in emotional truth. Now, here is the reality every man should understand. If you meet a woman during one of these phases and fail to understand what she genuinely needs during that stage of life, you will likely take her behavior personally. You may assume she is confusing, inconsistent, complicated, or impossible to understand. But often that is not what is happening at all. She is responding naturally to the psychological and emotional realities of the stage she is currently living through, a stage most men were never taught to recognize or understand. And here is the uncomfortable truth. A woman who feels deeply connected to you during one phase of her life may naturally drift away during another. Not necessarily because you failed, not necessarily because you did something wrong, but because her emotional priorities, fears, desires, and long-term needs evolved over time. The men who avoid constant confusion and disappointment are usually the ones who recognize this pattern early. They do not rely only on chemistry or timing. They build relationships based on emotional alignment and genuine compatibility with where both people are in life. Because the real question was never simply, what does she want? The real question has always been, what stage of life is she currently living through? And once you understand that, many behaviors that once seemed confusing suddenly begin making sense. If this perspective just changed the way you see relationships, then the next discussion goes even deeper, revealing the subtle signals women tend to give during each phase of life, signals that most men completely overlook. Understanding those signals could change everything.